This is Ashley with Real People Painting, and today we are doing a still life painting of sunflowers, and we're going to show you how we did it. So, to start off, I'll introduce what paints we're using. So, I started off with just obviously the typical, like I've got white, I've got black. I think I'm using Mars Black here just because I've got a warm palette already. Mars Black tends to have a little bit of a reddish kind of warm tinge to it. I have raw sienna. I'm including medium cadmium red. I've got some yellow, I believe that's cadmium yellow as well. Some burnt sienna, and I've got a little bit of just a couple of variants of green, just because with the fact that we're doing a sunflower, I've got warm colors and everything. You don't want to use too much black and white to make things pop or to mute things. It's good to use the complement. And so with the reds, the yellows, the oranges, it makes sense for me to be using green instead of black, so that way it kind of adds some depth to the color. So to start off with the canvas, the first thing I want to do is kind of map everything out. I feel like I should probably mention ahead of time too, even though I have actually had some formal training when it comes to painting, I'm much more comfortable breaking the rules than I think maybe I probably should be, because with painting you're not supposed to use pencil at the beginning. You're not supposed to a lot of times people like for you to kind of map things out, to journal a little bit, personally I either like to just dive right in, or like to be like right on top of the painting, or using pencil, which is both are kind of no-goes. So what I prefer to do isn't necessarily right, but if the end product looks good or you're feeling pretty good about it, just go with what you feel. Like, nobody's gonna care at the end. So for the purposes of the still life and wanting to be legit, I'm gonna start off doing what's called an underpainting. So what an underpainting is it's kind of like the mapping of the painting. It's going to tell me where my values are, so like the highlights, the lowlights, all of that. And whenever you're doing an underpainting, you want it to be within the same kind of color range of the colors you're going to be using. So for example, I'm not going to like throw in some kind of like neon blue, obviously, because I'm using warm colors. So what I did is I combined some of my raw sienna along with I believe that is a green that's called hooker's green. It's kind of like a really deep, like dark, like kind of a hunter's green. And I mixed that all together. It has this weird, like, kind of funky color. But it's nice and neutral, and it incorporates the colors that I'm wanting to use anyway. So I'm going to block out the shapes. So I'm drawing with a paintbrush is what it is. So let's see here. So I'm going to end up having flower right here, roughly. And keeping in mind too, like whenever I'm painting with this, I'm painting knowing that I'm going to go over and fix it later. So I am just saying like, okay, well obviously there's these flowers right over here. This one is kind of behind this one. Make it a little fluffier. I know it's going to be fluffy in the end. Alright, so now I can see a tiny bit of the stem here and here. Now there's not much in terms of a background for what the still life is right now, but I can just kind of make up my own. The background isn't all that important with a still life, only to show where the light source is coming from. So my light source right now is coming from the back and from behind and from above. So I know that I'm gonna end up needing maybe if I'm feeling frisky, a little bit of the shadow is gonna be coming in this direction. So I will do this. And our improvised vase is going to be adjusted as well, because I didn't want to do glass for the sake of this video. Oh my goodness, just in case. So I've kind of mapped out a little bit of what I'm doing here. Depending on who you talk to, some people like to just use your the color that you have for your underpainting. to block in the values, some people like to start mixing in some of the colors that you're going to be using in the final product. So like, for example, I could maybe add just a tiny bit of my yellow to kind of brighten up where I'm going to be putting the leaves, or I could add a tiny bit of like some of the brown, or maybe even a little bit of the green, just to kind of like deepen the values in the very, in the center of the sunflower. I'll be honest, I'm not totally sure how I'm going to approach it yet, because I really, really like sunflowers and I kind of want to do it justice. But let's see here. So for the sake of simplicity, all right, so I know that my flowers are going to end up going right about here. All right, so I'm going to deepen this area right here. One thing to keep in mind, so I'm using acrylic paints, and acrylics tend to dry quickly, especially with, under certain circumstances like the lighting and everything. So you do have the option with acrylics of adding a little bit of water. It thins out the paint, but if you're just doing the underpainting, it's not a huge deal yet. It will be an issue like later on when you're wanting like thicker paint, or you're wanting saturated paint and something like the higher layers of paint, but right now it kind of doesn't matter. So let's see here. My petals kind of extend out a little bit, and I'm only able to see a tiny bit of the dark center here. I'm not able to see it at all right here. So I'm going to move these petals up a little. This one. There we go. This one's cool because I can't even see any of the green underneath. This kind of reminds me of like eyelashes. Like, you go to draw or paint eyes, like eyelashes are so weird because they go in all these different directions, and like I'm drawing these out and that's like the first thing I think of is like eyes. It's kind of spooky. So let's see here. This is where the center is going to be on this one. Alright, I realize that this looks like nothing, but in my head it looks like something. And you want to follow what you're seeing. Don't want to rush through it. And I know it seems like I'm rushing through it, but I've got a pretty good idea of what's going on here. So these petals you can see underneath. So let me do this. Kind of seal off that. Okay. Alright, so kind of decided what I wanted to do here. So let me switch gears. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the yellow, bring it over here, and pull a little bit of the paint that I was using from the underpainting over here to create kind of this muted yellow. I'm gonna help myself here with the background. Another no-no that I'm probably going to do because I'm a terrible person, you're not supposed to get on top of your painting. When I was in one of the numerous painting classes at one point, they're saying like you're supposed to have a full outstretched arm, and I don't know if it's because I'm little or if it's just that I'm bad at following directions, but I can't stand being right on top of the paint, or the I can't stand being away from the painting. So what I'll do is I'm going to start adding some of the color where I'm going to be doing the petals. So yeah, if I get on top of this, like, don't judge me. This is just, that's how I roll. But you don't want to worry about details right now either, for the record. It's something that you'll end up adding as you go. Another thing too, one thing that I've always enjoyed about still life paintings is that they're pretty forgiving. Like, you've got the general idea. It's kind of like, gesture drawings or figure drawings, or those things where the idea and the feeling of whatever it is that you're painting or drawing is what you're really trying to capture. So if it doesn't look exact, firstly, I mean, aside from the fact that you guys obviously can see what I'm painting, like, nobody was there. So if I ended up painting it like this flower facing the wrong direction or something along those lines, it's not the end of the world. But it is good to challenge yourself and try and get as close to what you're seeing as possible. So like with these petals here, these ones are kind of turning away from me. So I'm seeing a little bit less surface area in this area over here. So I'm going to want to get a little bit closer to the center. Also, another thing to keep in mind, like, you're going to probably want crisper edges, obviously depending on your style, but you might want crisper edges as you further along, but right now it's not a necessity. Also, depending on how thorough you're wanting to do this, you might want to do a background. Because I don't have as much of a background, what I might end up doing is filling in something like from my imagination, just to kind of emphasize like the light source later on, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So I'm going to come up here, work on this one just a little bit. So this one is closer to the light source, so it's actually a little bit more saturated than the one I was working on down here. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more yellow. Kind of help reinforce that this one is in more direct light. Something also to keep in mind. So with the darker colors, they obviously are going to show a lot better. So some of the lighter colors, it might take a little bit more paint, a couple more layers to really like cover up what it is that you were painting beneath it. Especially with yellow. So let's see here. There we go. Okay. It's funny because in my head I'm thinking like, okay, well, obviously this is why I prefer to use pencil instead of doing an underpainting. But let's be fair. That would be showing up underneath the yellow too. So it's not gonna matter. Let's see. I know that it doesn't look much like much. So let's see here. I feel like this yellow is just gonna cause me trouble later on. There we go. Another thing to keep in mind too is that the paint is gonna show up as bright as you put it on. So like, if I'm only using like a little bit of yellow, it's not going to cover up as much as I'm wanting it to. It's going to be a lot more transparent than I want it to be. So with some of the lighter colors, don't be afraid to really like put it on there. I mean, obviously if your painting is going to be flat and you're wanting no texture whatsoever, be careful if you're using a lot of it because it will dry with texture. And then it doesn't matter how many layers you put on there, you'll still be able to see the outline wherever it is that you left the texture. So let's see here. All right, so I've worked on this one a little bit. It still has the green underneath it, but I kind of don't want to switch colors just yet. It's good to use the color that you have, especially considering that unless you made a ton of it, you know, I mean, it's a more or less finite amount of paint, especially if you're mixing paint, which personally I recommend because otherwise it all looks kind of like bottled, you know. But in this case, I'm going to switch over and keep going with the color that I'm using. So the next one, the light is showing it a lot more on the petals that are furthest away from me than they are on the ones closer to me. And I think that's just because of the way that the petals are doubled up. So these ones back here are going to be a lot brighter than these ones closer to me. So I'm going to just go like this. So one of the benefits to doing a background, which I think an art teacher might have taught me at some point, is that it kind of acts as like whiteout in certain cases to be able to fix certain areas that you might have messed up on. So if I'm coming back in later with maybe a little bit of black to kind of touch up certain areas, it's going to help like shave some of the things back into place that I wanted there in the first place, but maybe kind of overpainted. So lots of petals. Holy jeez. All right. So in these ones that are closer to me, they actually have kind of like this brownish look to them. These sunflowers are adorably tipped red, and so I think that's part of the brown that I'm seeing. So I'm going to add a tiny bit of my burnt sienna to the color that I already have. That works really nice. Not that I'm doubting myself, but every now and then I surprise myself at the same time. So, see here, I'm gonna add some of the petals that are a little bit closer to me, and these ones are the ones that have doubled up and are mostly of the light that I'm seeing on these ones. If not straight up shadow, they're showing light through them. So I'm probably seeing a lot of the red that's actually in the petal right now, because they cheat. You know what they do. They put the red in the water and then it absorbs it. So there we go. Look at it's actually kind of coming together a little bit. I know that sounds weird because it's so early on, but I can use this, for the record, to build up the paint on these sides where it will benefit. So I know I just said that I was wanting to wait to move on to another color, and in my defense, I still am, because this final flower that's kind of hidden down here is almost entirely in shadow. And so I'm actually going to be using a further variant of the one that I'm using right now in order to paint that one. So I didn't lie. I'm gonna add a tiny touch of this because I really like this color. And this color, like as you build up, it's going to help amplify the color on top of it, which is part of the reason why you want to do an underpainting in the first place, is to help influence the colors that are going to be on top of it, because it all shows through. I mean, it's opaque to a degree. So down here, I had to go back and add a little bit more yellow, for the record, just because these ones, you don't have any light coming through to really like show off that red that's in it. So I've got a lot more yellow down here where the flower's in, in the shade. So come back down here, and I know that it's the most yellow closest to the base here. Alright, so come up and do some of these. I'm going to end up switching my paintbrush here in a little bit. But this is what's called a round. It's the one that's pointy. It's good for doing outlines. It's also good for detail work. Granted, you wouldn't want to be using something this big for something that's super little, but that's okay. Alright, so we've got a little bit more to do here. And even though I've progressed past the original color I was using for my underpainting, this is still more or less kind of an underpainting, simply because if you look, like, I'm using such little amounts of paint here. Like, up here it's thickened a little bit, but down here it's just so little. You can still see the canvas underneath it. So that's how you know you're kind of not using enough. Alright, so while I'm at it, I'm going to use the same paint over on this side to help add to the petals that I've got. Probably add too. Part of my approach with all of this isn't necessarily photorealism, because like I mentioned before, so like gesture drawings, like figure drawings, like the point of still life is to kind of capture kind of the essence and the gesture of what it is that you're doing. So yes, it's a good exercise in paying attention to detail. Yes, it's a good exercise in patience and really focusing on your composition, focusing really on what it is that you're painting. But at the same time, I mean, it's not going to look like a photo, which is fine. I actually personally prefer it because, I mean, like, awesome, you did a photo of sunflowers versus, oh, that's awesome, you actually took time and there's your style and there's, you know, all of the paint, you know, and all of the paint strokes and so moving on, I would personally feel better about it if I was able to see where the, you know, the stems are. So I'm going to move on to working on where the stem is and adding some of the green. So pull that in. Now the green in the stems are very pale. They have, I hate to do this, but I am going to have to add just a tiny bit of white, but I need to mute it because the white is going to really, really, really make this green stand out, and it just isn't going to look right. So the complementary color of green is red. I'm going to add, I don't want to really go all in with the red, so I'm going to stick to like burnt sienna, just to kind of make it calm down a little. There we go. And it's thinking about cooperating. Okay, so I like how the bottom, like the base of the flower, kind of just like holds the entire sunflower in place. As you fill in all of the pieces, start to see more of what you're actually painting as well. So the base kind of comes up and holds onto the petals. It's almost like little green petals underneath it. This one you can see almost all of it. So I'm going to really focus on this one. And actually, nah, I'll do that later. I was thinking that I would want to add a little bit to darken this area, but the more I look at it, it's only darker in certain areas. I think I'm going to go back on it later. So this in. So beneath that bottom of the flower, which I'm not a botanist, so I don't know what that's called, but the actual stem itself is more in the light than the bottom of the flower was. So I can even add just a tiny bit more white to lighten that up. One nice thing, which if you have the ability to do it, it can be good to build up the paint while the paint is still wet. So I'm not really going to be putting much emphasis on the container that we're holding it in, just because my focus is really on the flowers themselves. But this is more or less where they stop, and they all kind of like meet together. So, all right. This one's back here. The flowers kind of overlap it, so. I've reached that point in the painting where I start to get frustrated with myself. I feel like unless you are really, really quick at all of this kind of stuff, then everybody hits that point. All right, so I need to build up the paint. I need to work on highlights. I need to work on color. So I'm gonna grab a bunch of the yellow. I'm gonna add a little bit, yeah, it's too much, of the raw sienna. And that's gonna create like this rich, I would almost say it's like a yellow ochre, where it's like it's yellow and it's also a tiny bit of like that grayish brown, and it looks really good. And I usually use a ton of yellow ochre, but for whatever reason I didn't think about it today. Okay, so I think at this point with this color, I'm really gonna focus on the flowers that are the closest to me. So I'm gonna work on this one right here and a little bit of the ones that are in the back. So I'm gonna be bad. I need to be on top of it a little bit. Actually, I'm going I have so many art teachers who would be furious with me right now. Because if you're not careful, you can totally screw up your painting. Like, I definitely had paint on me at some point. I guess in that context, I probably still have paint on me. Alright, so I've reached a point now where I'm not really doing the underpainting anymore. I've built up enough layers that I'm actually legitimately painting. This is me working on the actual real layers. A lot of these petals are overlapping, so I'm working on the darker ones first, reinforcing the yellow involved, so that when I go over with a more saturated yellow, it's just going to really pop. I hate saying that, but it will. So I'll work on these ones back here, just a little. And now that I've kind of established where my petals are going to be, I know you can't really see it from this angle, but closer to here, it actually gets significantly darker and a little bit green. And that's just because you're able to see kind of like this underneath the flower petals. Petals are so, thin. So when I go back over there, I need to make mental note that I need to add just a tiny bit of green when I'm doing the yellow down there. If you have the ability, I highly recommend adding your colors to paint on top while it's still wet, and it helps to blend some of the colors a little better. Now see, I mentioned how I'm not a fan of using white if I can avoid it. I mean the same goes for black, obviously. Like you want to use black as infrequently as you can, because it can sometimes flatten a drawing or a painting if you're incorporating too much of just like a hard white or a hard black, because in life that's just not what it is. You don't have like an outline around everything. So in life you have warm and cool, and you have opposites, and actually incorporating the opposite of a color helps to create shadow. Like, it kind of neutralizes each other and creates a more complex and fun color. So, sorry, I know I keep touching the canvas and I'm terrible person. Alright, so down here, I kind of wish that I went with a lighter color for the underpainting, so I know that it's going to be a butt to try and cover up. But again, not the end of the world. Alright, so I think I'm going to switch. I'm going to switch to a different paintbrush, because this This one's kind of getting on my nerves at this point. Alright. This one has a nice edge. Looks like I used purple at some point in time. Hope I'm not using purple now. Doesn't look like it. Okay. This brush is significantly going to help me get these edges that I'm wanting. So, hypothetically. We'll see. Why isn't that working out? This is going to come in handy later when I'm doing the background, just saying. Alright, so it's a little bit saturated, but I'm wanting to use just straight up burnt sienna. Just keeping whatever was on my paintbrush, just kind of going in and working a little bit on the tips of this. And if you look, it's just, you can see where it's traveled up through the flower to reach the tips of the petals. So I can actually use the fact that this is a beveled paintbrush to my advantage. And instead of actually having to like have a full paint stroke, I just kind of dab at it. Follow the direction of the petals. And the cool thing is too, is that your paint still should be wet on the canvas. So you're pulling some of the paint that's already there as well. So it helps to blend it. You don't have to worry so much about it looking too choppy either. And with some of this, you're able to create that overlapping look with the petals. Some of the paint is much thicker than others, like where I've kind of built up the paint. Too, because I am so wanting to just hone in on a specific flower and just focus on that flower, and I'm really fighting it. This petal kind of curls a little. Actually, I mean, to be fair, they all kind of curl a little, but that one especially. Let the paintbrush kind of drag a little. So not all perfect. Over here, I'm not actually like doing as many of the lines. I'm trying to create that sense that we're looking at it a little bit more head on. And over here, there's a lot more yellow. Of all of these are red. And pay attention, of course, to the direction that the flowers are going in, to the direction that the petals are facing. Fix that a little bit more yellow. Nice thing about flowers too is that there is so much detail, so you could go really in either direction with it. You could focus on detail and really hone in on, how this particular flower looks, how these petals are facing, just the detail involved in each flower. Or fun with it. Enjoying the fact that you're painting. I feel like that's too much. See? Trying to figure out what I want to do to build up this paint. Right. I'd feel personally a lot better if I started focusing on some of the details, because part of me is just like, ugh. So the center of this has the most detail and super, super dark, super brown. So I'm going to mix green, black, and a little bit of my red to create the brown with the richness that I'm looking for. And excuse the fact that I don't specifically call out exactly which red, because the thing is that I could have used any. You want to go with what it, feels right. And for me, any red would do. Alright, so you can't see it very well, but the petals kind of like pool around the center of this. It kind of like pulls up a little bit where the petals are. So you come around. I can kind of be a little bit more heavy-handed here in the middle, obviously, because that's where it's going to be the darkest. But around where the petals are, I pull it just up a little bit. Helps to reinforce like where the petals are. You don't have to do it everywhere either, because some areas you're not going to be able to see it as well as others. And because I'm feeling frisky, I think I have a little bit of the underpainting, like brownish kind of color that I came up with before. And I'm going to lay over this, because there's actually a circle in the middle of the sunflower. So doing this adds a little bit more depth. A little more of the highlights. I can come over and do the same on this side. I'd feel a lot better if I was able to this. There we go. Kind of pull away from here. There were certain petals that were really kind of taking chunks out of the area I was able to see. Alright, going back through here. I added a little bit more of that brownish black that I had created. Petal twisted around over here. Here. There's actually a petal that kind of cuts straight across over here. But you can still see a little bit underneath. Okay. Now this one actually, you're able to see a lot more of the little variant details like coming through. So, out from the center. More. Okay. Add a little bit more of that brown here. Hang on. Let's do this. do with the round brushes, you can kind of dab at the paint with it just to create a cute little texture, especially considering none of this is flat right in here, you know, I mean, it's kind of fluffy. There we go. I'm gonna add a little bit more. And while it's still wet, it's just gonna blend with the paint behind it. Creates that texture. And let's be honest, my painting is sloppy. So it's nice having that texture to kind of reinforce the way that I'm going with it already. Let's see. Here, I'm not able to see very much of this. Home usually I have the painting on my lap in the most uncomfortable way possible because I don't like to get everything out just because I decide to paint, but that also means that I'm used to taking the painting and turning it in every possible direction so that I get the best angle as possible. So this one I wasn't able to see any of the center of it, but that's okay. So it definitely gets super dark closer to the base on this one. I'm actually going to add just straight up black. Alright. Same over here, so back to the texture. Alright, so focused more on these two. I'm going to work on the stems in the background. So my paint is mostly dried from what I was using before, but I'm going to add a little bit more green and some of the brown that I was using before, like for the centers, sorry. So a lot of the detail in here is basically the same that I was approaching with the petals, so let's see. You know what? Yeah. I was considering moving it, but you know what? I'm gonna so it's super dark underneath here. And I'm kind of gonna leave some of this area ambiguous. Because we've got so much going on. Some, you know, artistic liberties. Alright, so now I'm focusing on this one. I'm going to add just a little bit of white. So you can see the light source on this particular stem. And then add it. I'm actually going to come down and do the same down here. And what you can do is you can go on it kind of heavier on the side where it's closest to the light and just kind of lighten up how heavy-handed you are with the paintbrush, just so that you don't have to really worry about too much blending, because you should already have paint there. Alright, same right here. And this one, actually, you see the light on the opposite side. And since it's you know, it's a stem, you can be a little bit rougher with it. Now, I would come through here, and though most of it's in shadow, you are able to see a little bit of the highlights where some of the pieces of the base are kind of coming up. think some people would probably consider this style more painterly, which it means messy. Like, I'm really wanting to enjoy these sunflowers. Right, so I'm gonna come back through, and I already did the highlight, so I'm gonna come back through, add a tiny bit more the black and a little bit more red actually to help neutralize the color even further, and come in to do the opposite. So we're looking at shadow. So you see here, I'm able to see, I already started up here a little bit. And you know, this one's kind of blending into the other one. I'm gonna have to go back through and add a little bit of highlight to help distinguish this stem from the other. There we go. Sometimes just the direction of the paint helps to distinguish one thing from another. Actually, it's exactly how you can distinguish things. So it's definitely darker on this side, so I'm gonna come back around. So I just added like a little bit extra of that kind of little splotch of, I guess, I don't know what to even call it, like my black, since it's what I made. Now I'm going to actually use this area. I've got it a lot darker from this up here. I'm going to come back down to help reinforce some of the areas where the stems are coming down. So this one curls, so it's coming forward to face me. There's actually a shadow right back here, and it kind of curls back with the form of it. I'm using such little amounts of paint right now. I honestly feel kind of guilty. However, I kind of like it, and I just kind of go with what you feel, you know? Alright, so so this stem back here actually blends with this up here. So this one's coming down this way. I need to make sure that the viewer is able to see where. Be able to follow the path that I'm trying to portray here. So you. Some effort there. Now I've already kind of come to terms with the fact that I'm not super happy with this particular flower down here. However, it is still a part of this little bouquet. Just go over this a little bit further. Right. And considering the fact too that the rest of it I've been very lax with it. I've got some edges, but it's not super heavy. There's not a lot of paint. I'm not gonna feel guilty about not giving anything any real hard edges. I'm not gonna feel guilty at this point too about the fact that the petals aren't all facing in the directions that I want them to, or the fact that maybe actually, you know what? I'm kind of embracing it at this point. However, I do want to add a little bit of white to help brighten up these ones in the back. It's not blending as well as I want, so there we go. Just a little bit on the tips of these ones. Through here. My paint is drying before I can lay it down. And I could go over it with it's almost like a gel, and it helps to slow down how quickly your paint is drying. At this point, it's not a huge deal. So, kind of attacking the paint at this point with the white, and using it kind of to my benefit to show which direction the petals are going in. And I've kind of covered up a lot of the red that I'd used earlier, just as kind of like a guide. I might go back over it at the very end. These flowers, and then I'll just throw in Alright, so my container is really just here to hold this, so I'm not going to focus on it very much. However, I do need to focus on it at least a little bit to be able to do my background. And for the background, I'm going to use black. But I'm not going to do it like really heavy. Nothing else in this has been really all that heavy. And I'm only going to really be doing it to kind of emphasize certain areas. So like, for example, actually I'm going to switch paintbrushes. Feel a little bit better using something a little bit longer and able to hold a little bit more paint, a little more water. Can't tell, this is called flat because it's flat, and I'm purposefully aiming for an unfinished look. Like, I want it to look, the background's not my focus. Background is serving a purpose to help kind of cage in what I've painted, but it's not meant to be anything noteworthy. One fun thing about acrylics is that you can give it kind of a watercolorish look by adding a little bit more water to it, watering it down. Also, because of how liberal I was with my paint paint strokes how messy it is. You want to try and make it so that you can't really see where the brush strokes are going unless you intend on keeping it that way throughout. Otherwise it just kind of looks extra messy. Right now my mess is intentional and you can kind of tell that it's intentional. But the moment that you deviate from that, it just kind of looks meh. So right in here, got a little bit of the background that you can see. Ah, there it goes. Grab more of the black. Okay. So I can see through here just a little bit. It stops right about here where the container is. Sometimes with store-bought canvas, even though store-bought canvas is good because it's already primed. You know, you don't have to worry about going over it with gesso. You know, the canvas is ready to be painted on. But in some cases, because it's not like anything that you're doing yourself, it's still good to go over everything with like a layer of gesso just to prime the canvas. And I didn't do that here. Usually don't have an issue. It's not really necessarily like an issue. It does make things a little bit more difficult. So really here, and I'm just going over and I'm filling in the background. So I'm very broadly going through and filling in between the petals. Some people like to do this stage earlier on, but I was concerned with how I was going to be painting the petals in the first place, and I was going at it a little bit more freely than some people might, which again is fine, because see here, if you were to be painting, let's say like a person, because sometimes people do figure drawings and they'll be, you know, painting a person rather than doing a still life with flowers. It's the same concept though. You don't have, you know, an hour, you don't have days to be able to do a drawing or a painting of a person, so you get down the gist of it more or less. And that was what my goal was here. It's just to figure out how I wanted to approach it. Maybe just kind of enjoy the sunflowers, honestly. I don't know if you could tell. Sunflowers are kind of my favorite. So, yeah. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm just going to kind of fill in everything. And here in a sec, you'll get to see the finished product. Okay. And here is the finished product. Right, so thank you so much for joining me today on Real People Painting. If you liked what you saw, please, you know, like, subscribe, hit the bell so that you can be notified anytime that we have a new painting or a new video for you.